I want to think today about Judas, who's one of the characters we've been thinking of in our Passion Week this year. Judas, of course, is the villain. He's the guy who betrayed Jesus, and I think there is something in that. But I think if you want to take his character at full value and full complexity, you need to see some of the reasons why a lot of people are more sympathetic to Judas before revisiting why we think he's so problematic. And people who are more positive about Judas feel really he's been maligned. And they might point to the first thing, which is just the gospel writers are people who have been so hurt by what Judas did that he broke up the fellowship by betraying Jesus. And John in particular is obsessed with highlighting any possible motivation that Judas might have and making it a bad one. So, for example, when a woman cracks some expensive perfume over Jesus' feet, Judas points out, well, actually, we could have taken that money and given it to charity, given it to the poor. Well, why use that expensive perfume? And he's got a kind of point, but John doesn't allow that point. He said Judas, no, he didn't want it for that reason. He kept the common purse, and he was a thief, so he wanted to steal that money. So possibly we're recovering Judas from the other gospel writers who just kind of really did not like him. Another thing is the word betrayed is a translation of a Greek word paradidomi, which almost always we translate as handed over. But somehow when it's applied to Judas, we translate it as betrayed. So it makes a big difference. Judas handed Jesus over to the authorities, maybe for Jesus to prove himself, or he betrayed Jesus to the authorities. It's the same Greek word, but how we translate it has quite a big impact on what we think Judas's motivation was. And the third way of rescuing Judas, if you like, is to try to think about the fact that Jesus almost eggs him on to do it. Do you remember when he says, if whatever you've got to do it quickly? He kind of says it is necessary for something to happen. And some people have even said, well, Judas didn't have any free will in the matter. And these are quite powerful arguments. And I think you need to consider that when you're looking at Judas, that there's a complexity of motivation. But he, when it comes to it, he gets it wrong. And I don't think we should lose that either. And I was influenced in thinking about this by an encounter I recently came across, though it's quite well known, about a woman called Christabel Bielenberg, who is an extraordinary woman. She's born, I think, in England, but married someone German in the 30s, so she lived all the way through the Third Reich, before and during the war. And then she ended up in Ireland or somewhere. But she's one of the people who gave interviews to the documentary series The World at War. So you may see her interviewed in that. It's got that famous documentary series which is from the 70s, but it still gets repeated all the time. And she described in one episode that it's during the war, and a Jewish family knocks at the door, and they said they need to shelter. And so she takes them in and said, look, you can stay for a night or two, and then I'll have to talk it through with my husband. And what happens is she talks it through with her husband, and people have made clear to her husband that if they harbour this family, she, her husband, and Christabel will be seen as traitors. And maybe best case scenario, they go to jail. It could be worse. It could be bad for their own children. And so they're in this horrendous position. And she actually asks the Jewish family to leave the next day because it's too risky for them. And the Jewish family don't make any fuss. They just go. And then in this interview, Christabel tells you that in fact she found out that they died. They were taken to a concentration camp and they were killed. And she realises she played a part in that. And she actually says it was then that Hitler had turned me into a murderer. And it's very powerful to hear, because you also understand where she was coming from. This was such a difficult situation she found herself in. And I often think about situations like that when we pray, save us from the time of trial, or lead us not into temptation, which is often translated as save us from the time of trial. Probably better, actually, the time of trial. This was a time of trial for her. But she doesn't excuse herself. She makes clear that she got it wrong. She was the murderer. And I think even as we, try to work in our understanding of Judas's motivation, his decision was wrong. And he did that, I think, freely. That's what was the case with him. And I think, yes, we pray that first we don't get in those situations because it's incredibly hard. But then we pray, if we ever do get in one of those decisions where you have to flip one way or the other, you can't sit on the fence, you have to flip one way or the other, we pray that we may do what God would have us do.